If I've learned one thing in my 20-odd years as a cop, it's that people are fucking crazy. Even in a small place like the Pacific Glade, where half the town is just cliffs and trees, you run into your fair share of nut jobs. I can't count the number of times I've busted a stick-up where the perp turned out to be toting a power drill or a pair of particularly sharp garden shears. If you're cuckoo enough, you'll find a way to turn any household appliance into a murder weapon. Crazy people are just the start of our problems, though. Pacific Glade is a town full of monsters, and not all of them are human. Sometimes they like to put a human face to blend in with the crowd, but make no mistake, there's stuff out there that would make even the most hardened of men shit their pants and hide in a closet like a terrified child. I'm talking creatures that would sap you of your sanity, or feed off chunks of your past, or make you hallucinate your dead loved ones. Now, call me a crackpot conspiracy theorist if you want, but I've seen it happen. I've lived it. And I've lost people close to me in the process. Sounds like a dangerous place, doesn't it? Luckily, our police force is one of the best in the nation. We have to be. We've seen enough weird shit to last a lifetime, and by now, we know how to deal with it. Don't get me wrong, I've got nothing but respect for our other brothers and sisters in uniform, but something tells me that they haven't dealt with half the crap we tackle on a daily basis. For newbies on the force, it can be a rude wake-up call. Take our latest recruit, a 20-something hothead named Zachary Atwater. Fresh off the bus from the sunny beaches of Northern California. I knew from day one that he would be a tough egg to crack. Kids like him, they think that they've seen enough road rage and drug deals to make them as seasoned as the rest of us. But put a gun in their hands, they suddenly don't know which way is up. I wonder what would happen when he faces his first weird case. Everybody on the force has that first one. The case that makes you realize you knew jack shit about the way the universe really works. For Officer Atwater, that case was a stick-up at the local grocery. Some townie had barged into the store waving a fireplace poker, and he broke some jars and stabbed a few people on the way to the deli counter, where he began shoving chunks of meat into his jaw. Atwater and I were two of the cops sent to defuse the situation. The newbie liked to bark orders to sound all tough and intimidating, but the guy at the deli counter was too busy gorging himself to care. When Atwater inched a little closer, the townie turned around and roared like a hungry animal. His eyes an acid green. A tangled mass of purple snakes burst from his open mouth and hissed angrily. "What the shit?" Atwater cried. Sure, it was weird, but no weirder than half the stuff I'd seen since Tuesday. I lifted my arm and spoke into the radio on my shoulder. "Send him in." The automatic doors at the front of the store slid open, and the light overhead began flickering. One by one, a shadow fell across the aisle. The automatic doors at the front of the store slid open, and the lights overhead began flickering. One by one, a shadow fell across the aisle. I stood aside as a 7-foot-tall figure in a trench coat and gray fedora walked past me. Plumes of orange smoke billowed from the cigar stuck between his teeth. The man at the counter noticed him approaching and stopped shoving meat into his gullet. A low whine issued from his throat, like a frightened dog. "I'm giving you one chance," said the tall figure. "Evacuate your vessel, and I'll send you home. Burrow any deeper, and you die." For a second, I thought the guy, or the thing inside him, might actually listen for once, but then he drew up his fireplace poker and made a stabbing motion towards the man in the coat. The tangle of snakes erupted from his throat again, their tongues flitting in and out like little red streamers. "They never learn." He strode forward, crossing the distance in just a couple of steps, and grabbed the mass of snakes before the other man could even react. The figure in the trench coat yanked back as the smoke from his cigar shifted into a bloody red. The guy at the counter shrieked and tried to pierce the man's coat with his poker, but the makeshift weapon only jabbed ineffectively at his skin. He scrabbled at his own throat, gagging as the tall man pulled a long, stringy wad of purple from inside the guy's mouth. The snakes went listless as the scaly mass ripped free from his throat and fell wetly to the ground. The man sank to the floor and conked his head on the tiles. I watched, tense. It was our job as officers to preserve life whenever possible, but that was sometimes easier said than done in cases like this. The human body doesn't react well to possession, and it doesn't do so hot either when the possessor is ripped out like a set of intestines. But the guy's chest was rising and falling, and his fingers were twitching slightly. He was alive, which was more than I could say for the lengthy strand of gunk that had been yanked from his throat. Suspect is unconscious, but breathing, I said into my radio. Situation is under control. The trenchcoat figure stepped over the dead snakes with some disgust and joined me by the shelves of produce. That was when I noticed our new recruit standing there, slack-jawed, trembling, his gun pointed somewhere down by his feet. The cocky expression had been wiped clean from his face. I knew I shouldn't enjoy the moment, but what the hell? It was satisfying to see the hothead knock down a peg. "Who the fuck are you?" Atwater shouted. I shared a knowing glance with the man in the trench coat. He tipped his hat to the new recruit, his lips curling into a smile around his cigar. "I guess you haven't met the inspector," I replied. I'll admit, as much as I love our boys and girls in blue, as much as I trust them to get the job done, we'd have been fucked a long time ago if it weren't for the inspector. He's our ace in the hole. To the outside world, he's just a federal agent. But us Gladers know the truth, that he actually comes from someplace else. The world just next door to ours. He knows more about the universe than any of us measly humans could hope to understand. We're lucky that he's taken an interest in our well-being instead of squashing us like bugs. We've been through a lot, the inspector and I. And to me, he's more than just a secret weapon. He's a good friend. I think hanging around us for so long has made him a little more human. He'll even go out to drinks with the crew after a particularly rough day on the force. Although the inspector doesn't exactly drink, if you catch my drift. His glass depletes just like the rest of ours, but I think he's probably siphoning the booze into another universe or something. It's a shame, too, because I've always wondered how much alcohol it would take to get a being like the inspector sloshed. Some days just aren't drinking days, though. And on those days, the inspector will usually join us at home for a wholesome family dinner. My wife, Janine, she's the best cook on this side of the Pacific Glade, and she always has a piping hot meal ready for us when we roll in from the station. The inspector doesn't exactly eat either, but he's happy to sit with us and chat while we satisfy our bellies. Our family isn't your typical picket fence kind of deal. Aside from the inspector, we've also taken in Ruth and Stephen Hannigan, a mother and son who lost their home in the infamous Pacific Glade quake a couple of years ago. Ruth's husband, Mark, he was one of the best cops I'd ever had the fortune to know, and the inspector's partner on the force before me. We lost him in the quake. Same with Ruth's son, Rory. The Hennigans were good friends of ours, and the least we can do was open our home to them after they had lost so much. And that's us. A couple of lesbians, a mysterious entity from another dimension, and half of a tragedy-stricken family. Hardly the nuclear model, but we'd make do. We're together, and we're happy, and in this crazy world of monsters and madness and all sorts of suffering, that's really the best you can ask for. Atwater may have had his first oddball case, but for the rest of us on the force, it was hardly our first rodeo. Things had been escalating in Pacific Glade lately. All sorts of monsters were rearing their heads. Some squatting in human skulls, others wandering our forests and streets in all their grotesque glory. Just the other day, I'd plugged this scorpion-cougar hybrid thing that had been terrorizing visitors at the Catamount campgrounds. If that image makes your head hurt, you're probably one of the sane ones. The inspector's at a loss to explain what's going on. Though we've known for a while the Pacific Glade sits on top of a rift in reality. And sometimes these beasties finagle their way into our world. Emphasize on sometimes. Most of these creatures are too dense to cross dimensions on their own. The last time we experienced an infestation of this magnitude, there was a team of scientists down here by the lake who were letting these things in on purpose. To study them. I mean, talk about crazy. Near as we can tell, though, Capra and its experiments are long dead, which is good, all things considered. We just know fuck all about why these incidents are happening again. It's exhausting. Even the inspector gets drained. He doesn't talk about it, but I can see how gray his skin gets, how shabby his coat and fedora become when he's just been in the world for too long. Sometimes he'll disappear for a bit into the strange dimension he calls home, just to recharge his batteries. That's why I wasn't surprised to find him absent from our kitchen when I returned home from the snake intestines case. We had a guest staying with us for a few days, Ruth's cousin Trina, who was in town to pay respects to her uncle. It was coming up on 2 years since Peter, Ruth's father, had been struck and killed by a runaway driver. I have to confess, I had forgotten she was coming. I deal with weird shit on a daily basis that sometimes more ordinary things, like a relative coming to visit, tend to slip my mind. Ruth was making her cousin a cup of coffee when I walked in. Trina was a small, mousy woman with bright blue eyes, curls of brown hair, and cheeks that always seemed flushed, like she was embarrassed by an off-color joke. She didn't say much as she took sips from her coffee. Her dress was a pale sky blue, and it hung baggy on her, as if it had gone through the wash too many times. "Thanks for letting me stay with you," she said to me, after I draped my coat on the rack and poured myself my own cup of joe. "I wouldn't have minded staying in a hotel, but the closest one is miles away. You're really out in the middle of nowhere, aren't you?" "That's why they call it the Neverglades," I replied. "If you didn't know we were here, you'd never find us." Trina chuckled, but her eyes didn't laugh with her. She looked down into her cup and took another slow, steady sip. "Is Stephen going to be joining us?" she asked. Ruth was cleaning out the kettle, but she glanced up at Trina's question. "If you can tear him away from those video games, be my guest," she answered. "But I don't think he'd want to come anyway. He hasn't been down to visit the gravesite in a while. I think it might still be too upsetting for him." Trina nodded. "What about you? It's not too upsetting for you, is it?" Ruth placed the kettle aside to dry. She had her back to her cousin, but I could see her profile from here, and there was a sadness. Ruth placed the kettle aside to dry. She had her back to her cousin, but I could see her profile from here, and there was a sadness in her eyes. A flash of something buried. Something she didn't want anyone to know. It was gone in less than a second. "No, it's fine," she said. "I like going to visit them. It's kind of cathartic." There was an energy in the room that hadn't been there before, so I took that as my cue to leave the cousins be. I took my coffee into the den and fumbled through the couch cushions to find the TV remote. I wasn't even sure what was on tonight, and mindless television was becoming my go-to routine after these daily doses of supernatural shit. I just dug up the remote when my cell phone began to buzz. Hoping it was Janine calling to say that she'd be home soon, I pulled it out from my pocket and checked the caller ID. It wasn't Janine. Someone was calling me from the reception phone down at the police station. Part of me prayed this wasn't another case, but I'd been on the force long enough to know that was wishful fucking thinking. I had the phone up to my ear and said, "Olivia Malconey speaking." "Sheriff?" said the voice on the other end, but they couldn't seem to say anything more without sobbing. It sounded like Abigail Shannon, one of our longtime officers. Her voice was high and warbly, and I couldn't make out more than a few words at a time. "Easy there, Shannon," I said, retreating back to the far corner of the room and covering my other ear to hear her better. "Take it slow. Tell me what's going on." Abigail managed to steady her voice and come down to a reasonable volume. "He just came into the station," she said as she choked up a little bit. "I was working the front desk and he just walked in. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if I should talk to him or if he was, you know, a trick or something, like that kind of stuff that you and the inspector deal with. Who are you talking about? I asked. Who came into the station? Abigail went quiet for a moment. Then her voice regained its tremor. She said, "We buried him. He was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to be dead, Sheriff, but he was here tonight. He was here." "Don't go anywhere," I said, barreling into the hallway. I grabbed my coat from the hook and threw it on, keeping the phone tucked in my shoulder. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Where are you going?" Ruth asked as I passed the kitchen. She came to the doorway and stood in the threshold, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. "The station," I said briskly. "I'll explain later." Trina came over to join her cousin, a look of curiosity on her face. I didn't have time to stop and tell stories. I pushed open the front door and hurried down the driveway towards my cruiser. If Abigail was right, then the dead appeared to be rising in Pacific Glade. And I guess it says something about my fucked up life, that the revelation didn't faze me in the slightest. I'd been expecting some kind of disaster zone when I burst into the police station, but there was no alarm bells ringing, no shattered glass windows or blood smeared across the walls. Morbid, I know, but my mind tends to go there a lot these days. You know, Abigail Shannon was waiting for me at the reception desk. She rose and greeted me with a handshake. Her palms were trembling, and there was a haunted look in her eyes. "Officer Shannon," I said, "what happened here?" Abigail swallowed. "I was doing my crossword puzzle at the desk, you know, like I always do, and the front door opened, and I figured it was someone checking in, so I handed them the clipboard without really paying much attention, but they didn't take it. So I looked up, and it was him. He was standing there. It was Nico." A chill went through me. Nico Sanchez had been an officer here on the force, but he'd been brutally murdered at the station's Halloween party last year. And this time it hadn't been some human whack job. An old enemy of the inspector, some shape-shifting monster called the Semblance, had crashed the party and buried an axe in Nico's chest. Everything went to shit after that. Ruth and I were able to subdue the entity and keep it from slaughtering any more innocent people, but it still managed to give us the slip. We hadn't heard a peep from it in months. I had a feeling that was about to change. "You're sure it was Sanchez?" I asked. Abigail frowned. "I think I remember my dead boyfriend, Sheriff." "Fair enough," I replied. "Was there anything weird about him?" The last time the Semblance had shown its face, it had been wearing the shape of my old colleague, Mark Hannigan. The disguise wasn't perfect, though. Its body had been glowing slightly like a neon bulb, and its eyes were a solid blue, no irises or pupils. It was a pretty signature look. If the Semblance was wearing Nico Sanchez like a Halloween costume, we'd know. "I mean, the fact that he was here at all was the weirdest thing," Abigail said. "But you're right. There was something off about him. His facial expression never changed. He was looking right at me, but his eyes were glassy, like he wasn't seeing me at all. And his skin, it was kind of waxy." Her brow furrowed in thought. "You know, now that I think about it, it's almost like I was looking at a mannequin. Like a dummy dressed up to look like Nico." I said. "What did he do after you noticed him?" "He just stood there and stared. I thought he might try to come after me and strangle me or something, so I reached for my gun, but then he just turned around and shuffled out of the station. I almost ran after him, but I was sort of paralyzed, you know. Seeing him had thrown me off my game." "I understand," I said. I'd felt the same way when I saw the imposter Hannigan last Halloween. I've come to terms with it, you know," Abigail said. "With him being gone, it's been a while, and it still stings, but I wasn't letting it keep me from doing my job. Seeing him like that, though, was like It was like something reached out and squeezed my heart, and it hurt. She looked forlornly at the floor. I'm sorry. I should have gone after him. Hey, don't apologize, I said. I placed a hand on her shoulder. Whatever that thing is, it was trying to sucker punch you, to get you where it really hurts. Just glad it didn't get any worse damage than that. Abigail nodded, sniffling a bit. What should I do now, Sheriff? Stay here. If Sanchez comes back, or if you see any other walking corpses, get to safety ASAP and give me a holler. I'm going to get the inspector. I have a feeling that we're going to need him. You got it, Sheriff, Abigail said. She resumed her seat behind the reception desk, and I left the lobby to wander out into the parking lot. The night was just on the cusp of falling, and the sun was in that low process of setting over the top of Mount Palmer. I reached into my coat pocket for the inspector's calling card. Mark had passed this little slip onto me before he died, a shiny card that, when burned, would summon the inspector from, well, wherever he happened to be. Don't ask me how it works. All I know is that having a hotline to our secret weapon has saved my ass more times than I can count. Kept it in my pocket at all times along with my trusty lighter. There was only one problem. My lighter was there. But the card was gone. I slapped every pocket I could think of, feeling for the little slip of paper, but no dice. I felt my gut churn. I tried telling myself that everything was fine. I must have left it on the kitchen counter or dropped it on the floor when I hung up my coat. But the timing felt too perfect. Too intentional. Like someone didn't want me to call the inspector. I jumped in my cruiser, and I booked it back home. There was every chance I'd find the card there, safe and sound. After a little digging. But I wasn't holding my breath. The house was unnervingly quiet when I stepped into the front hall. Ruth and Trina must have gone ahead into the cemetery, and Stephen was probably out with his friends or holed up in his room playing video games. Janine wasn't home yet either. I headed straight for the kitchen and not even bothered to take off my coat. There were loose papers and stacks of mail piled up on the counter, so I sorted through them hastily. I must have gone through that junk heap 3 times, searching for that damn card, and when it became obvious I wasn't going to find it, I left the mail and poked my head underneath the kitchen chairs. My nerves were getting so frayed that I must have jumped 2 feet in the air when I heard someone clearing their voice in the hallway. Looking for something? Said Trina. I straightened up. Ruth's cousin was standing in the threshold wearing a heavy black jacket that practically swallowed her tiny frame. She stared at me, bemused, her head tilted slightly. Yeah, sort of, I said. What are you doing here? I thought you and Ruth were heading to the cemetery to pay your respects. I told you to go on ahead, Trina replied. There was something I needed to get back at the house. What are you... I started, but the words died in my throat. Trina's sleeve had slipped back, and in her hand she was clutching the inspector's calling card. A little reflective slip glimmered in the kitchen lights. Sit down, she ordered, and her eyes flashed, turning a solid neon blue. The lights flickered like a power outage. I let out a shaky breath, watching it turn into mist before my eyes. Something told me that this would be a very bad idea to reach for my gun on my hip. I took a seat, unable to take my eyes off of those glowing blue bulbs. You're the semblance, I said. The fucker we fought last Halloween. Are you the one bringing corpses to life? Trina blinked, and the solid blue disappeared. Her lips curled into a smile. Thought that might get your attention, she said. Think of it as a sneak peek. A preview of coming attractions, you might say. I don't understand, I said. The inspector told me that your whole shtick was making reflections real, or something like that. Not sure how reanimating corpses fits that particular gimmick. Oh, you don't see it? Trina asked. The dead are just hollow reflections of the living. You dress them up, color their cheeks, fit them into the nicest clothes, give them the illusion of life so they can sleep in their graves. Like department store mannequins. You waste your resources on preserving something that's already gone. Forever. I've never understood that about your kind. She cocked her head. Does that make it hurt any less? Does blowing on those dead lumps of charcoal spark something in your blackened heart? Maybe because we're not psychos, I said through gritted teeth. Maybe because we'd rather remember them healthy and happy. So it's not about them at all, she asked with a smile. It's about making the rest of you feel less miserable about your existence. Twist it however you want, you sick fuck, I said. You may be chattier than most of the monsters I deal with, but I'm sure you bleed just as easily. Your nihilistic bullshit isn't going to work here. Trina's smile grew a fraction too wide. The skin on the corners of her lips cracked and began to bleed. No, she said. I always assumed you'd have a harder shell to break, Olivia Marconi. That's why I'm not going after you yet. Your time will come. Just not tonight. And what do you call this little powwow then? I asked. Her eyes spun with a sudden surge of blue, like sparks forming in her irises. A distraction. I whipped the gun out of my holster and fired a single shot. In the time it took me to blink, Trina had already disappeared. The bullet slammed into the far wall and shattered a mirror hanging in the hallway. I got up hastily and left the kitchen, flinging open the front door. The night outside shivered with faint gusts of wind, making the grass rustle, but I couldn't hear a sound. No voices, no footsteps, not even the rumble of a car engine. I didn't know how Trina had vanished, but I had no doubt she was far away from here by now. Our whole conversation had been a big misdirection. I wasn't the semblance's target tonight, and if what it says was true, that Nico's walking corpse had been a preview of a coming attraction, then I had a feeling we'd be overrun with zombies before the night was out. It sure would have been nice if my one hotline to the inspector wasn't in the hands of a psychopath shape-shifting monster. Shit, I breathed. Ruth had gone on ahead to visit the cemetery, which meant she was neck-deep in Zombie Central. The semblance's intentions were brutally clear. Ruth was its main target, and if it didn't get to her in time, she wouldn't survive the night. I leapt into my cruiser and I peeled off down the street, sirens blazing. This is Sheriff Marconi, I barked into my comm radio. Any officers in the Pond Street area, converge on Locklear Cemetery. I repeat, converge on Locklear Cemetery. We have a situation. My comm went silent for longer than I would have liked. Then a crackle. This is Officer Atwater. I'm on my way. I swore under my breath. Our hot-headed rookie wouldn't have been the first person I'd asked to cover me in a situation like this, but no more voices came crackling through my radio. No more backup was on its way. Atwater was all I had. I sure as hell hoped that would be enough. The streets were almost empty, and the few cars I did encounter pulled aside when I roared by. The stretch of road leading up to Pond Street was at the very lip of the forest, surrounded on both sides by a fringe of towering trees, and I couldn't see a damn thing as I rounded each corner. Every time I drove down this way, I half expected to go careening off the road and straight into a tree trunk. My fingers were white-knuckled on the wheel as I took each turn, treading that careful line between speed and caution. Locklear Cemetery was situated on a hump of land in the middle of the forest, just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Lake Lucid. I nearly spun out when a huge swarm of blackbirds flapped past my windshield like some sort of fucking Poe story. These crows had been out in full force every time I'd come down to visit Hannigan's family plot. It was getting close. I just hoped the semblance wasn't closer. The trees parted and the slope of the cemetery rose up to meet me. I skidded to a halt by the gates and climbed out of my cruiser. Atwater was already parked nearby, his lights dark. He was leaning against the car and fiddling with the safety on his pistol. His frat boy frame cast a bulky shadow in the moonlight. What are we dealing with, Sheriff? He asked. Honestly, rookie, explaining would take longer than we got. I pulled out my own pistol and stepped up to the cemetery gates. They were still open at this hour, but everything beyond them was drenched in the shadow of night. Each gravestone outlined by the moon above. Let's just say that if anything bursts from the ground and tries to shamble towards you, put a bullet in its head. Zombies? Seriously? Atwater scoffed. You expect me to believe that shit? I expect you to shut up and do your job, I responded. Now come on, we're wasting time. I raised my gun and hurried into the cemetery, my footsteps heavy on the dirt path. Atwater trailed behind me with all the steadiness of a gorilla. There was no one else out and about. Ruth preferred some privacy when she came to visit her family, and the emptiness was putting my nerves on edge. The full moon was up, and each gravestone cast elongated shadows across the grass. Living in the Neverglades, you come to assume that every shadow is hiding a monster. That's how you stay alive. We reached the top of the hill, and two figures came into view, their black coats almost hidden in the darkness. Ruth was bent down over her family's graves, placing something I couldn't quite make out beneath both headstones. Trina stood above her. Her back was turned to us, but I could see her hands glowing with a soft blue tint. Her nails elongated like a mountain lion's. She drew back her hand to strike. I planted my feet and I aimed my gun. "Back off!" I barked loud enough to send birds scattering in the trees. "Or I'll put a bullet in your brain!" Ruth glanced back surprised. She saw Trina's descending hand just in time to avoid a slash across the face. But the claws still raked down her arm, sending a spatter of blood across Roy's headstone. She cried out and fell backwards. I fired a succession of quick shots, but the semblance leaped aside before any of them could land. It got its balance quickly, black coat flapping. "Atwater, get Ruth to safety," I shouted. "Which one's Ruth?" he shouted back. "For fuck's sake, the one being attacked!" Atwater barreled past me and fired a few shots of his own, and this time one connected, sinking into the semblance's shoulder. It grimaced and staggered back. In the time it took to recover, Atwater had already reached Ruth and started dragging her away from the gravesite. She swayed unsteadily as she fled with him. Her sleeve was still bleeding, but she was pressing her other hand against the wound to staunch the blood the best she could. The semblance's face turned into a wicked snarl. It lifted its hands, palms up, as if to start some incantation. Then the ground beneath the family headstone began to rumble. Hands burst through the soil, straight up, George Romero style, and two bodies heaved themselves out of their graves. One was an old man clutching a wooden cane. The other was a young boy, barely in his adolescence, his dark hair slick with blood. Dirt tumbled from their bodies as they rose slowly to their feet. "Rory?" I heard Ruth whisper. "Dad." "What the fuck?" Atwater uttered. I was ready to put a bullet between both their eyes, but a sound from behind me made me pause. I whirled around to see a dozen more dirt-stained figures walking towards me, striding with full confidence of the living. No shambling dead here. Their faces were waxy, like Officer Shannon had told me, and their skin had a weirdly glossy sheen. They were men, women, children, all of them, dressed in their Sunday best. Their fingers were curled into the unmistakable shapes of claws. I fired at the first one approaching. His head exploded in a spray of plastic goop. He slumped lifelessly to the ground. The second shot clicked on an empty barrel. I ducked behind a tall gravestone and hastily reloaded my gun. There were too many for me to handle alone, and between the semblance and the zombies of Ruth's family, I was sure Atwater had plenty to deal with on his own. What we could really use right now was the inspector, but he was somewhere out of reach. Or was he? I stuck my head around the headstone and glanced over at the semblance. It was still lifting its head to summon more of the walking dead. Its head turned to the sky. The inspector's calling card was just barely visible in its coat pocket. I could see the little reflective glimmer in the moonlight. One of the zombies grabbed onto my arm, and I let out a hiss of surprise. It was a woman in a flowery dress with long, flowing hair. Her nails were remarkably sharp, so I elbowed her in the face and broke free, darting out from behind the gravestone. I only had one shot at this. If I missed, the semblance's undead minions would tear me apart like paper mache. I got in position. I took aim, and I fired. The bullet zipped through the air and struck the semblance clean in the chest. Right on the inspector's calling card. A single bright spark flashed across the material, casting a quick rainbow shadow across the surface. The semblance staggered back, slapping a hand to its chest. "No," it breathed. The sky overhead darkened, taking a deep purple twinge, and I looked up to see a shadow creeping across the face of the moon. Thick fog began to billow around my feet, enveloping the rows of headstones, turning everything that same shade of violet. The zombies stopped approaching, their legs appearing to be rooted to the ground, the soil reaching up like hands to trap them in place. And then he appeared. The inspector. He strode out of the mist in all his 7-foot glory, teeth clenched furiously against his cigar. The mist that now swept across the ground seemed to be issuing directly from its tip. The moon resembled its usual shine as he stepped forward, hands in his pockets, to confront the semblance.
I should have known you wouldn't hide forever,
he said in his gravelly voice.
Whatever you're up to, it ends tonight.
Trina's face twisted into a scowl.
Inspector,
the semblance hissed. There was a curious echoing quality to its voice, like a dozen people were speaking through it at the same time.
Bold of you to show your face tonight. Things didn't work out so well for you last Halloween, I remember. Back then, you had the element of surprise,
the inspector said.
I promise you, you've lost that particular advantage.
He glanced around the swarm of gathered zombies, still standing motionless in their dirt prisons.
Raising the dead. That's a bit unusual for you. What do you have to gain here, exactly?
The semblance glared at him.
You're looking at this all wrong, it growled. What you should be asking yourself is, what do you have to lose?
Enlighten me, the inspector replied. The smoke billowing from his cigar took on a warning shade of red.
I was alone, the semblance said. You locked me in a world with no mirrors, no reflections, no light or sound or anything. And when I had nothing, you were gallivanting off with your flesh puppets, making friends, starting a family, turning this sickening world of theirs into your second home.
The semblance's face flickered, changing from Trina's pale complexion to something harsh and blue and staticky, a flash that sent stabs of pain through my head. It was gone in less than a second.
I'm going to do to you what you did to me, it spat. I'm going to take away everything you love, one piece at a time, until you're left with nothing, starting with these humans you're so pathetically fond of. You're a coward,
the inspector said, his voice low and threatening.
Using these people as pawns just to satisfy your thirst for revenge, that's petty. It's beneath you. Our fight is between us, and it always has been.
The semblance's lips pulled back into a toothy leer.
This isn't a fight,
it said.
It stopped being a fight a long, long time ago. Now, I just want to make you hurt.
Funny, I said. We've got that in common. The semblance whirled around, and while it had been yammering on its grand revenge scheme, I'd been circling around it, ducking behind the headstones and sticking to the shadows. It had been so focused on the inspector that it hadn't paid me a damn bit of attention. Probably didn't even see me as a threat. That's one mistake it would come to regret soon enough. My fist slammed into Trina's face with enough force to leave a bruise. The semblance staggered backwards, touching its bloody lip. But I didn't give it the chance to get its bearings. I lowered my gun and shot it clean through the foot. It howled in pain and slumped to the ground, blood pooling in the sticky puddle in the grass. I threw back my fist and landed another punch, sending it sprawling against Mark's headstone. Atwater bounded up to us, grabbed the semblance roughly by the shoulder, and clapped a pair of handcuffs on its wrists. "You're under arrest," he barked absurdly. "Easy there, rookie," I said. The inspector approached. Clouds of dense red smoke billowed from his cigar, floating through the cemetery like patches of rusty mist. He loomed over the semblance, coat flapping, violet eyes narrowing in a glare. The entity wearing Trina's face looked up and flashed him with a blood-soaked grin.
Your flesh puppets are stronger than I gave them credit for, it said. They're not mine, the inspector said darkly. I'm not a possessor, like you. I don't acquire people the way you acquire faces. These humans are strong. They're not afraid of you. And if you think you'll be able to hurt them so easily, you're an even greater fool than I believed.
The semblance's eyes flitted over to me. I won't be making this mistake again. Damn right, I growled. I brought my gun down into its temple and squeezed the trigger. But instead of splattering its brains all across the ground, the bullet zipped through empty air, shattering the top of Mark's headstone. The semblance had dissolved into a flurry of crows at the last second. I batted the birds aside as they swarmed over me, wings slapping wetly at my face before vanishing off into the tree line beyond the cemetery gates. The sound of their fluttering died into the night. I brushed the dampness off my cheek with some disgust. All around us, the reanimated corpses lost their waxy sheen, slumped to the ground. The inspector surveyed the field of the dead with something unreadable in his eyes. I finally felt safe to lower my weapon. Like always, it was only after the fight was over that I noticed my heart pounding a mile a minute. "Is anyone going to explain to me what just happened?" Atwater said. He was still supporting Ruth, although she seemed more stable than before, if a bit pale in the face. She kept looking at the spot on the grass where the shadow of her cousin had disappeared, where the bodies of her father and son still lay cold in the dirt. "Just another day in the Neverglades," I said. "You get used to it, kiddo."
"I'll get Ruth back to town. Find her a doctor," the inspector said. "Olivia, do you mind cleaning up here?"
"Nothing the rookie and I can't handle," I said. The inspector nodded. He reached out to take Ruth's hand. She grabbed it gratefully, then nestled against his trench coat as the two of them made their way to the cemetery gates. I watched them until the mist obscured them from sight, and then I turned back to the rookie. Atwater was glancing around the sea of dead bodies, the look on his face so helpless it was almost comical. "You heard the inspector," I said, smiling in spite of myself. "Find a shovel. We got some graves to dig." Signed, Olivia Marconi. Hey there kids, it's me, Mrcreepypasta, and I just wanted to thank you so much for watching tonight's video or listening to it on the podcast, if that's how you happen to get it. Mrcreepypasta Storytime is available on any podcasting service that you happen to use, and actually across a lot more as of this month. We're now on Spotify, on Apple, on Google, on just about everything else, because I don't use podcasting on anything else besides those. And a very special thank you to everybody on that Patreon, patreon.com/Mrcreepypasta, especially Ariel Torres, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Brianna Van Tine-Janzen, Chompski, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Sindee Barney, Asia, G. Weevil 3, Diana Kraus, Stephen VanHuss, Tristain Pelton, Nico, TheGingerBroz, Dante Rowe, Raphael Rodriguez, Don Meulmeester, Eliminator 86, SteampunkSinner, Kaleb Dougal, Sky Harbor, The Homeless Bird 93, Gabrielle Undefined, Bobby Carmen, Liam Newman, Aaron Stormcrow, Bobby Jean Torgan, Dr. Strawberry, The Wormhole, Barbara Macedo, and Vic. Thank you guys so much, and if anyone would like to join them on that list, head over to patreon.com/Mrcreepypasta. Here's hoping that you guys are loving the horror as much as I am. And sweet dreams.